Today, there is little visible evidence of the trolleybuses, once operated by St Helens Corporation and the South Lancashire Transport Company, or SLT. In St Helens, this is the site of the former Carlton Street Power Station, with just one building surviving. Several substations also remain. This is one off Lugsmore Lane. A much rebuilt SLT example can be found at Haydock. These had once fed current to the web of trolleybus wiring opened between 1927 and 1943 and phased out between 1952 and 1958. Sadly, none of the veteran South Lancashire trolleybuses escaped the scrapman, and the sole St Helens survivor exists simply because it was sold for further service and subsequently rescued by enthusiasts. Some money from the sale of this tape will go towards ensuring 387's long-term survival. The St Helens and SLT wiring wove its way through a large area of industrial southwest Lancashire. The 14-mile St Helens-Atherton route shown in orange being jointly operated. By the 1st of September 1958, everything would have been swept away. Our coverage begins in St Helens, world-famous home of Beecham Pills and Pilkington Glass. The trams serving this bustling manufacturing town were replaced over a 9-year period by a mix of single and double-decker trolleybuses. Unfortunately, no cinefilm has come to light of any vehicles. Owing to the many low railway bridges, early double-deckers were of the low bridge variety. Some rare footage does exist of the 10 Sunbeam MF2s with 100 horsepower motors acquired in 1942. Originally destined for Johannesburg, they had 8-foot wide Massey bodies, all of which had to be refurbished in the early 50s. 10 Sunbeam Ws with 85 horsepower motors and 50-seater austerity row bodies followed in late 1945. Also glimpsed later on film will be the 1937 Leylands, given a new East Lancashire body in the late 40s. The last 16 trolleybuses all had 8-foot wide high bridge bodies. 182 to 189, delivered in early 1951, were BUT 9611Ts with 56-seater East Lancashire bodies. 174 to 181, delivered between December 1951 and February 1952, were Sunbeam F4s with 55-seater East Lancashire bodies. In 1951 it was intended to replace the trolleybuses on all the routes except the Parr and Prescott Circle. The next photographs provide a brief overview of the sections shown in green abandoned on the 2nd of February 1952. The extension to Ackers Lane only dated from 1943. Leyland 131 is seen at Ackers Lane on the final day of service. 132 turns at Denton's Green terminus. This was one of a batch of 11 vehicles surviving from 1935 to 1952. The Denton's Green turning circle is now used for parking cars. Leyland 103 turns for St Helens at Moss Bank. Here the turning circle, dating from 1934 and in use by buses until the 1980s, is still clearly visible. Wartime Joburg waits to cross the East Lancashire Road. A cross-town 6 bound for Denton's Green is seen at St Helens Junction. Rebodied Leyland 129 of 1935 dips under one of the 2 low bridges on Robbins Lane. Closer to town, the junction trolleybuses passed under another low bridge on Peasley Cross Lane. Here the southbound wiring was splayed out in order to operate a roof-mounted safety cut-off switch, should any high-bridge vehicle stray inadvertently onto the route. This view shows the negative boom on the right at the low angle. This was the illuminated warning displayed in the cabs of all the high-bridge fleet. Today a solitary pole still stands sentinel in Peasley Cross Lane. For the 1952 conversions, St Helens purchased 25 London Transport RT-type AEC Regents, an initial batch of 15 having arrived in 1950. Among vehicles sent for scrap were the surviving 1935 Leylands, rebodied after the war. Also condemned were the 1938 Ransom's D4s, most of their Massey bodies having been refurbished after the war. The St Helens system was now down to the Par and Circle routes, together with the jointly operated interurban to Atherton. On the Par route a new turning circle was installed at Boardman's Lane in 1952, and part of the wiring was even renewed the following year. In June 1955 the surviving trolleybuses were renumbered, the 4 rebodied 1937 Leylands becoming 301 to 304. The refurbished utility sunbeams 305 to 314. The refurbished Joburgs 357 to 366. And the 8 Sunbeam F4s 374 to 381. And finally the 8 BUTs 382 to 389. The other system featured in this video was owned by the South Lancashire Transport Company, who in mid-1955 announced plans to abandon its sprawling 35-mile network, whose route pattern it claimed was no longer financially viable. Also, many of the communities it served were in terminal decline. Equally, the veteran fleet of low-bridge Guys and pre-war Leylands were in urgent need of replacement. The company's trams had been ousted between 1930 and 1933 by a fleet of low-bridge, row-bodied trolleybuses. Numbers 1 to 30, dating from 1930-31, were 3-axle Guy BTXs with 90 horsepower motors. When delivered, they had bulbous front panels, stencil route indicators, drop windows, draining tubes from the upper deck guttering, and 8-leg trolley gantries. As will be seen later, many would lose some or all of these features during their long life. Numbers 31 to 46 of 1933 were smaller 2-axle Guy BTs with 80 horsepower motors. Number 47, a Guy demonstrator built in 1930 and acquired by the SLT in 1935, would be withdrawn in 1951. Like all subsequent deliveries, it had a high-bridge body. Next came 48 to 53, row-bodied Leyland TTBs of 1936-7 with 90 horsepower motors. Amongst these was numbers 48 to 51, purchased on behalf of Bolton Corporation. Later these 4 vehicles became Bolton's nominal property, but always carried SLT livery and lettering. 52 to 58 of 1938 again had Leyland TTB chassis with 90 horsepower motors, but more modern-looking row bodies. To cope with heavy wartime loadings, 6 Carrier Ws with 80 horsepower motors and Wayman bodies were delivered during 1943-4. Seen in the first post-war livery is one of the 6 Wayman-bodied Sunbeam MS2s with 115 horsepower motors delivered in 1948. 53 is also in the first post-war livery with large shaded fleet numerals, whilst the Sunbeam is in the second overall red livery except for the grey roof. Starting in 1950, the company began rebuilding some elderly guys. Initially, 16 were given deeper lower panelling and completely new fronts, with down-swept chromium-plated windscreen surrounds. Then in 1953, numbers 1 and 7 were totally rebuilt, but this proved too expensive. As a result, 9 further guys received only new fronts, leaving the bodywork behind the front bulkhead untouched. The final 4 would be given rubber as opposed to chromium windscreen surrounds. The penultimate rebuild was number 28. The last of all, number 24, is seen first in virtually original condition. On return to active service in 1955, it was painted in the company's third and final post-war livery. The other classes face less drastic action. For example, the first batch of Leyland simply lost their half-drop windows and distinctive bulbous front panels, although Bolton owned 48 did receive this new front in 1954, the only high-bridge vehicle so treated. Most of the 1938 Leylands underwent minor modifications, such as replacement of their troublesome half-drop windows. These were also replaced on all carriers except number 64. Other modifications meant only 64 and 65 retained their headlights in the front panels, whilst on 63 the headlights migrated to side-mounted brackets. The post-war Sunbeams remained much as built, although following an accident 67 did lose the characteristic Wayman flare to its platform panels. Seen departing from Bolton's Howelcroft bus station, 71 would eventually be the last SLT trolleybus to run. Returning to St Helens, the Parr route was replaced as from the 13th of November 1955, although for another year there were scheduled peak hour and Saturday journeys to Boardman's Lane, with the occasional unscheduled trolley also sneaking through to Parr. The 8 Joburgs were now withdrawn. Owing to their powerful 100 horsepower motors, they had been banned from the joint route. The first SLT closure involved replacement of the local Bolton service as from the 25th of March 1956. Most of the locals ran just over 2 miles to terminate at Hulton Lane, where a wide turning circle had replaced an earlier reversing Y in 1936. Service was usually provided from Howbridge Depot by these 3-axle Leylands. Following the closure, the circle was rapidly dismantled. At certain times, some journeys were extended to 4-lane ends. Here, a reverser was situated in Back Manchester Road, just south of the Bolton boundary. Similar Ys existed right across the network, especially on the joint route. All 4 Bolton-owned vehicles were now withdrawn, including recently rebuilt number 48 and number 50, seen climbing Newbrook Road on a through Lee Bolton working. After the closure, they sat waiting their fate in Bolton's Bridgeman Street depot. Life-expired Guys also went for scrap. Looking somewhat weary, 36 wends its way through Worsley a few months before, in January 1956. Back in St Helens, scheduled workings to Boardman's Lane ended on the 9th of November 1956. Then, 2 days later, the 14-mile jointly operated interurban was also replaced. Although the SLT never used route numbers, St Helens did. One was Atherton, whilst 2, 3 and 3A covered short workings within the town boundary. As a result of the oil shortage created by the Suez fuel crisis, St Helens left the wires to Haydock in situ until the following April. The SLT's 4-wheel Guys were mostly restricted to short workings between Atherton and Haydock, but they did occasionally venture into St Helens, following a lengthy one-way circuit inbound along Corporation Street and past the Town Hall. The boarding point for the interurbans was in Ormskirk Street. Here the wiring allowed trolleys on the circle to pass on the offside. Filmed on the final evening, SLT number 1 climbs Higher Parr Street and will be seen soon cresting the hill and crossing the inbound wires. Today this area has been obliterated, lost beneath industrial units and a dual carriageway. For the first 4 miles, the trolleys served the St Helens mining suburbs of Blackbrook and Haydock. Both corporation and company trolleys terminated at the Ram's Head, Haydock. An excellent view of the double step and offside sunken upper deck gangway on the lower bridge Guys. The 9 miles of company wiring linked heavily populated communities in the Lancashire coalfield. But occasionally the trolley buses did escape from the rows of back-to-back and terraced housing, for example here in the vicinity of Haydock Racecourse. Number 1 turns from Warrington Road into Penny Lane at Old Boston Corner, an area now crossed by the M6. These sequences, filmed on the 18th of May 1956, show race trains bringing punters to Haydock Park Station. Although this former Great Central line had lost its passenger service in 1952, it remained open throughout for goods until 1965. Even after that, special race trains continued to run to Haydock Park until the 70s. An approaching train of horse boxes. This was just one of a dense network of main line and mineral railways serving the Lancashire coalfields. Here an NCB loco trundles through Haydock Park. Across its network, the SLT used a variety of traction poles, some dating from the tramway age. Right to the end there were sections of original 18-inch gauge wiring, often alongside newer replacement lengths at the 2-foot gauge. For example, here in Bamfalong, the gap between the positive and negative wires on the left was 2 foot, those on the right just 18 inches. An LUT Foden pursues rebuilt 42 through Bamfalong. One relic of the tramway age was Templeton Road, which skirted the centre of Platt Bridge. Here the trolleys bumped and bounced over the potholes and fossilised tram tracks, which would remain until 1986. On one journey, a friend and I watched the roof of one of the SLT guys rising and falling from the body pillars. Later, walking along, we saw literally bits dropping off the slowly disintegrating trolleybuses. Known locally as jiggers, the many additional extras run at peak hours and for colliery shift changes were provided with several short-term facilities along the length of the joint route. For example, this reversing Y was in Church Street, Hindley. Approaching Dangerous Corner, spanned until 1953 by a low bridge carrying mineral trains to and from Parsonage Pit. In the background, many older buildings were awaiting demolition. Heading along Smallbrook Lane, Dangerous Corner, towards Atherton, centre of SLT operations. By the mid-50s, this once busy colliery and mill town had lost much of its industrial base. Arriving from St Helens, drivers on the joint route had to follow precise instructions when reversing into the Lambeth Street Y, where the head shunt wires passed over the top of the wiring into Mealhouse Lane. This slide shows the limit of the head shunt, with the reverser off to the left. A St Helens sunbeam sits in Lambeth Street as an SLT guy passes through the company's most complex overhead junction. Platt Bridge, which had housed the 18 Guy BTXs and the 8 Guy BTs licensed to operate in St Helens, now became a bus garage, surviving until 1986. Parts of the structure, together with a lone traction pole, remain today and can be seen from the blocked former approach road. Among the 15 trolleybuses earmarked for scrap but placed in store owing to the Suez fuel crisis was number 2, still with its bulbous front cab panel. Unrebuilt number 19, seen at Worsley Courthouse, also retained its bulbous front panel. On the condemned list was recently refronted 22, seen passing the now demolished gateway leading to Worsley New Hall. Among the BTs withdrawn was unrebuilt number 34. St Helens withdrew its surviving pre-war Leylands. 8 wartime Sunbeams also went, leaving just 311 and 312 for driver training and emergency passenger duties. The St Helens system had now shrunk to 8.37 miles and 18 vehicles. With maintenance reduced to a bare minimum, the wiring at busy junctions like Toll Bar was in a very fragile condition. In fact, it was the chronic state of the overhead which hastened the demise of this profitable but neglected system. Behind the Ribble bus, a glimpse of one of the corporation buses that from early 1958 started to appear regularly on the circle. Ever since the closures of February 1952, a variety of corporation and other operators had dominated the town centre. Before the final closure, both 1945 Sunbeams would be withdrawn. 312 had since 1955 been the only UK low-bridge trolleybus to sport retrievers. The end came shortly before midnight on the 30th of June 1958, when the last trolleybus entered Hall Street Depot. The 7 operated the circle in the clockwise direction and the 8 anti-clockwise. Various short workings were numbered between 9 and 12. Journey time round the 8-mile circle, on average, 44 minutes. In their 31 years, the electric buses had run 51.5 million miles, carried in excess of 600 million passengers, and most importantly, always operated at a profit. Much of the town centre has altered beyond recognition since these scenes were filmed. For example, Griffin's on the corner of Westfield Street and Sefton Place was demolished in 1974. On the curve from Ormskirk Street into Bridge Street. These scenes were filmed variously between 1956 and 1958. Passengers for the Circle would board outside the market. Passing an RT outside the Savoy Cinema, now demolished, whilst another trolley heads for the loading point. Turning into the busy shopping thoroughfare Liverpool Road, now bypassed by a dual carriageway. Tyrers was subsequently relocated and this building demolished. At the end of the in-town one-way loop, 376 accelerates smartly up Cropper Hill, approaching the Circle Junction at Toll Bar. Whilst turning into St Helens Road, 376 clicks through the Frog for the Toll Bar turning circle. Inbound from Rain Hill, 384, resplendent with its corporation coat of arms, crests Lugsmore Lane and turns towards town. Following the clockwise 7, heading for Prescott via Rain Hill. Short working Saturdays only 9s worked to and from Prescott via Rain Hill. Sharing this section was bus route 24 to Sutton Manor. An inbound 8 tackles the grade up to Toll Bar. Looking across Lugsmore Lane Dam. This old humpback bridge at Thatto Heath Station has since been replaced. The turning circle at Rain Hill was still regularly used. The huge hospital complex, together with its boundary wall, would later be demolished. Already in position, one of the new bus stops. Housing estates now cover these fields at Rain Hill Village. Passing outside the Coach and Horses, Rain Hill. On busy Warrington Road, a Crossville low-decker heads for Warrington as an anti-clockwise 8 turns towards Rain Hill. Wiston Hospital. On the outskirts of the small industrial town of Prescott. Having terminated in Prescott, a short working 9 heads back towards St Helens. This was the halfway point on the circle. In the background, part of a loop, which also doubled as a Y. A non-stop procession of buses passed through Prescott en route to Liverpool. Liverpool's trams at last served Prescott in June 1949. Once, many years previously, it had been possible to travel by tram all the way to the foothills of the Pennines. Heading back to St Helens, a clockwise 7 passes the King's Head, demolished in the 80s. This part of St Helens Road, with bracket arms on either side, now forms part of the Prescott bypass. Most of these green spaces north of Portico are now filled with houses. Beecham's clock tower dominates the horizon on the way into town. Public service would end on the 30th of June 1958, by which time the swift, silent trolleybuses looked shabby and soiled. This map shows the wiring in the centre of the town. The circle trolleys use the wiring shown in white. The yellow was needed to reach the depot, whilst that in green was retained for emergencies. Hall Street Depot, built for horse and steam trams in 1889, was enlarged 10 years later to accommodate the electric fleet. It finally closed in 1984. Now in its new guise as the St Helens Transport Museum, it is hoped it will open to the public during 2006. Much of the building, including the stable area, is still in original condition. Just before midday on the 1st of July, 374, driven by Mike Butler and adorned with suitable valedictory banners, made a clockwise run round the circle, carrying invited guests, under the watchful eye of conductress Mrs Entwistle. Arriving back at the depot, the power was switched off, bringing to an end almost 59 years of electric traction. However, the 16 modern trolleybuses did find service elsewhere. At the beginning of 1958, the SLT still had 44 active trolleybuses. However, before exploring the remaining services, a few photographs to illustrate some aspects not caught by the filmmakers. For example, the antique interior of a pre-war Leyland. The upstairs seating arrangement on a low bridge guy. Having no auxiliary batteries, the trolleys had to be turned by means of cables connected to the overhead by bamboo poles, and also to the hook-down trolley booms. Imagine such a tangled web of wires and poles waving about in today's safety-conscious culture. Over the years, new Leyland-built trolleybuses were tested on the SLT. These included this unique twin-steering six-wheeler built for London transport. It is even supposed to have carried passengers when on test. Owing to the close proximity of the Leyland factory, these test runs continued until 1957. A few years earlier, this double-decker destined for Colombo was on test. Here, sister vehicles were filmed in Colombo. At the beginning of 1958, the longest route meandered for 14 miles between Farnworth and Atherton, two towns just 5 miles apart as the crow flies. Few people ever made the full journey, and even when they did, they had to rebook at Swinton. Another longish service linked Moseley Common to Lee, whilst there was a local jigger covering the Farnworth-Swinton section. In Farnworth, the trolleys followed a lengthy one-way circuit with a layover point in Brackley Street. The wires seen on the right fed into the original reverser, still used 3 days every year on the occasion of the annual fair. Action on Long Causeway. All these upcoming film sequences were taken during the final 3 years of operation. "70 minutes was allowed for the full 14-mile trip to Atherton. Southwest from Farnworth, the route passed under a low bridge on Clegg's Lane. To prevent the trolley booms fouling their parking hooks, the Atherton wiring was offset to the near side. Although clearance was very tight, high bridge vehicles were able to pass underneath. The wires along Clegg's Lane were suspended from former tramway bracket arms. Poles fully extended, leading into the right-angle bend past the Co-op building in Little Hulton, prior to running for a mile along Manchester Road East into Walkden. A full turning circle encompassed the memorial at Walkden. An unusual detached Y served Sandhole Colliery at shift times. As there was no connection to the main wiring, the booms had to be transferred 3 times to complete the reversal. 2 vehicles seen heading away from Swinton towards Walkden. The last Guy BTX to be rebuilt approaches Swinton. Outside the Bull's Head, the neglected wiring would twang up and down as drivers edged cautiously out into busy Partington Lane and the major loading point at Swinton St Peter's Church. When withdrawn in June 1958, 45 retained its bulbous front panel, 8-leg trolley gantry, extractor ventilators, and was still in the first post-war paint scheme, complete with large shaded fleet numerals. As 45 departs for Atherton, a Farnworth jigger prepares to enter the Vicarage Road Y. After pulling the frog, conductors had to guide the driver into the reverser. combination of these jiggers and the through trolleys provided a 7.5-minute headway on the Farnworth section, fare 9d. The single fare to Atherton was £1, return 1 9. '22 leaves Swinton for the 27-minute run to Farnworth. On the 40-minute run to Atherton there was a basic 15-minute headway. By the mid-50s the trolleys were rarely full, as passenger loadings declined along with the area's labour-intensive industrial base. A short distance after leaving St Peter's Church was Swinton Depot. This provided the Farnworth jiggers and some vehicles for the through service. Opened for trams in 1906, it housed trolleybuses from 1931 to 1958. After serving for some time as an LUT bus garage, the site is now occupied by a housing estate. Turning from Partington Lane into Worsley Road. Crossing the trunk East Lancashire Road. These next scenes capture the leafy charms of Worsley, with its rich legacy of early canals, mines and railways. To pass under this colliery railway bridge, both sets of wires had to be positioned very closely together, with less than 12 inches between positive and negative wires. The 1903 building at Mill Brow provided an attractive backdrop as Farnworth bound number 27 heads towards the colliery bridge. Number 10 has just crossed the Bridgewater Canal. Here number 1 crosses the canal heading towards Worsley Courthouse. At the courthouse turning circle, number 20 clicks through the various frogs en route to Farnworth. Leaving the picturesque courthouse en route to Atherton. Note the virtual absence of other road traffic on the outskirts of Boothstown. Bracket arms were used in the narrow centre of Boothstown. The second crossing of the East Lancashire Road at Moseley Common. Seen in the background of this photograph, Moseley Common Colliery, once the largest in the country, employing over 5,000 men. A regular service ran from this reverser to Leigh via Atherton. Parbrow. Manchester Road, Tyldesley. At the west end of the Tyldesley one-way section. Westbound through Tyldesley. Hynesford. Turning into Market Street on the long one-way section through the terrace streets of Atherton. Travelling behind a carrier along Market Street. The wires on the left were used for short turn and depot workings. At Bag Lane, Sunbeam 66 is followed by Guy 19, still with its bulbous front panel. Atherton was the company's operational hub. Even after the loss of the joint route, there was still plenty of activity along the one-way sections, with frequent trolleys negotiating the various junctions and passing landmarks such as the Savoy Cinema and the Punch Bowl Hotel, arriving at the Savoy at the end of the trip from Swinton. The other remaining service using the Atherton one-way system was the trunk 7-mile route from Leigh to Bolton. Bolton was by far the largest and most significant town served by the SLT. The SLT always referred to its trolleybuses as trolley vehicles or trackless trolley buses. As in St Helens, there was a lengthy one-way loop through Bolton town centre. Flanked by elegant Victorian buildings, a Leyland TTB negotiates the tight S-bend leading into Howelcroft bus station, opened in July 1948. Offset by the grimy red brick splendour of McGee Marshall's bonded warehouse, another TTB passes a Bolton Corporation craven-bodied Crosley before drawing up at the Leigh boarding point. Latterly there was an 8.5-minute headway at most times of the day. This vehicle still retained its tow bar aperture at the base of the front panel. The southbound wiring left Howelcroft along Great Moor Street. Journey time to Lee averaged 37 minutes. Single fare to the Bolton boundary, 8p. Near the end of the outbound section of one-way wiring. Climbing through Daub Hill, a neighbourhood of old closely knit housing and small shops. With their powerful 115 horsepower motors, the post-war Sunbeams could speed up the steep grade. Northern Counties bodied Leyland PD1 growls up Derby Street, whilst an MS2 purrs up behind it. Carrier 64 prepares to stop outside Tootle's Sunnyside Mills. Despite conversion of the SLT tram route to Atherton in December 1933, Bolton's trams had continued running to four-lane ends until the 28th of March 1936. A short distance south of Hulton Lane in the early winter of 1956, and the road has been liberally sprinkled with salt. Looking out from Whitegate Farm. Approaching the Bolton boundary at four-lane ends. Waiting to cross the junction with the A6. The LUT crew, glimpsed in the background, have just completed a changeover on bus route 38. This damage sequence shows a learner driver with suicidal tendencies at four-lane ends. Heading for Atherton, 71 leaves four-lane ends along Newbrook Road. Church Street, Atherton on the one-way section. Lee-bound trolleys use Church Street and Market Street. Those heading for Bolton turn first into Wigan Road, then past the former junction for St Helens and finally into Meal House Lane. Arriving at Atherton from Lee. Turning into narrow Meal House Lane. Amongst the terraced houses heading for Bolton. Back at the Savoy and turning into Wigan Road. Leaving the Punch Bowl for the run south to Lee. On the climb up Lee Road, Howe Bridge can be seen in the distance. Another chance to see number 48 passing under Howe Bridge before it was rebuilt in 1957. Some 2.5 miles from Atherton was the mill town of Lee. This was where cotton had once been king, providing employment for thousands. The trolleys terminated on private land off the appropriately named Spinning Jenny Street. The additional siding had been laid after the war for use by the Moseley Commons Service. Turning into King Street. A view outside the company's headquarters at Howe Bridge. Open for trams in 1901, the depot housed trolleybuses from 1931 until the end of service. Howe Bridge was also home to the company power station and workshops. Across the road was a Lancashire United bus garage. Normal service ended shortly before midnight on the 31st of August 1958. Vehicles from Swinton Depot being driven to Howe Bridge on trade plates. Within the depot confines, one sunbeam had been repainted. As the SLT had ceased to exist the previous night, on September the 1st, number 71, adorned with suitable inscriptions, made LUT's one and only trolleybus journey. When crewed by Messrs Hasler and Henry, it carried civic dignitaries to Lee. Here members of the public had been allowed to cram on board for the return to Howe Bridge. 58 years of electric traction was over. 40 years later, this historic landmark, together with the former power station, would be razed to the ground. As a result, virtually nothing remains of the fascinating South Lancashire Transport Company. The two surviving poles alongside the boundary wall and the single pole at Platt Bridge, together with a few SLT manhole covers, are all that survive today. Back in 1958, St Helens had succeeded in selling their 16 modern trolleys, the 8 Sunbeam F4s going to South Shields. After receiving some modifications, all were in service by September 1959. However, their stay proved short-lived, the majority being withdrawn for scrap in April 1963. The 8 BUTs sold to Bradford were thoroughly refurbished and all entered service during 1959. Withdrawal took place over a number of years, with the last pair surviving until the end of June 1971. Fortunately, one of these, 799, was rescued and restored as St Helens 387. Currently, it is being refurbished at the Trolleybus Museum, Sandtoft. For a while, 387 did spend time here at St Helens Hall Street Depot, now home to the North West Museum of Road Transport. It is expected that the museum should open to the public in 2006. As a result, it is possible that one day 387 may return again to its spiritual home to represent the swift, silent trolleybuses that served this corner of southwest Lancashire for over 3 decades.